Courage to Change, Wisdom from Assisi, with Dr. Gillian Ahlgren. I'm Allison Borden, the Director of Youth Ministry for Bellarmine Chapel. We're happy to be co-sponsoring this live stream with Xavier University's Institute for Spirituality and Social Justice. If you are watching this live, please know that there will be a Q&A at the end of the presentation. You can submit your questions at any time in the chat box to the right of this live stream, or by using the web form linked on the same page you've visited to access the live stream. Just click the blue button that reads Submit a Question. Also, if you would like to order a copy of Dr. Ahlgren's book, on the same page there's a blue button, Order Gillian's book. That will take you to her book on Amazon. And many thanks to Father Eric, who is running our tech support tonight. Now to introduce Dr. Gillian Ahlgren. Dr. Ahlgren is a professor of theology, a church historian, and a specialist in the Christian mystical tradition. She received her doctorate in the history of Christianity from the University of Chicago. Widely considered one of the world's leading experts on Teresa of Avila, she has written extensively on other spiritual leaders, including Francis and Clare of Assisi, Ignatius Loyola, Julian of Norwich, and Hildegard of Bingen. She is the author of 7 books, including The Tenderness of God, Reclaiming Our Humanity, and Spiritual Exercises for the 21st Century, a workbook. Dr. Ahlgren has been teaching at Xavier University for 30 years. She also does significant pastoral work in the local community and beyond, with a particular interest in the spiritual enrichment of women who have survived domestic violence. Let's welcome Dr. Gillian Ahlgren.
Thank you so much. And again, welcome. I'm very glad for this opportunity to reflect together on courage and change. 2020 is surely going to be the year that we learn courage. We are being tested in ways that very few of us could ever have imagined. And this time of challenge, with all of the uncertainties, anxieties, stress, and suffering, is trying our very souls. We shall have to draw strength from resources we may not even know that we have. This is the time to come to know courage, the wisdom, character, and strength that comes straight from our hearts. Courage comes from the Latin word cor, meaning heart. And we may forget this, but the heart is not just soft and tender. It's a muscle. It's strong. The steady strength of the heart pumps life into the human body, just as acts of courage energize all of us in the human family, giving us hope and strength to carry on. But before we consider courage, let's reflect first on change. Because we are in the midst of a vast, even frightening series of changes, we need some way of navigating, of knowing which way will help us forward, so that we don't lose ourselves and our goodness in the throes of all of this change. COVID-19 has already required so many changes of us as we adapt to quarantine, to social distancing, all that has been suspended in our lives: travel, community gatherings, work, education, worship. Already, we've also seen so many examples of courage and creativity as our norms change. And now we begin to wonder how, and on some days, even if, we will all emerge. It seems wise then, if we're in this for the long haul, to take advantage of this pause that has been imposed on us, to consider, learn, discern, and embrace the changes that will lead us together toward a better way forward. We can turn for guidance to people from our past who have successfully navigated deep and graceful changes, so that we can learn from their wisdom as we ask ourselves, what growth and change might this time call forth from us? What needs to be cultivated and grown? What is not worth taking forward? And what will we leave gracefully behind? These are the kinds of questions that visionary leaders, the ones that we call reformers and prophets, have had the courage to ask and answer in other difficult moments. I thought that tonight, Francis and Clare of Assisi, two people who were particularly good at change, might help us to recognize how our own circumstances today can call out of us a process of growth and change that the Christian tradition calls metanoia. Metanoia is a thorough and holistic process of change, rooted in our deepening commitment to goodness. Metanoia is the way that, empowered by God, we place our whole selves in the service of something beyond the mere self. Metanoia is the holistic change that connection with Jesus drew out of people. It is a coherent and compelling process of change that we grow into as we begin to grasp the reality that we are part of a much larger picture than ourselves. Metanoia is the change in our hearts, our considerations, our choices, what keeps us up at night, and all of our actions that we embrace as we see ourselves as part of a rich and diverse human family, part of a web of creation that is more intricate and fragile and precious than we can even understand. Metanoia is set in motion as we set about the work of honoring God and one another, and take our place as stewards in this world of ours, trying to love it as God loves it, caring for it and for one another, attending deeply to the well-being of all. If we are going to have to change, as we now know through this virus that we shall, why not implement the changes that will truly be best for us, for all of us? This virus may give us a unique opportunity to embrace a more fulfilling, life-giving way, if we have the courage to change. As many of you know, I spend as much time as I can in Assisi, a small town of great moral, historical, and cultural significance, because it is the town where Francis and Clare, two sensitive young people, inspired a hopeful movement of change nearly 8 centuries ago. Some of you have even been to Assisi with me in the footsteps of Francis and Clare. We go to Assisi not because we are nostalgic for a distant past. We go to Assisi to learn, to be sensitized to what matters, and to see what is possible when we collaborate with God and with one another in a process of growth that leaves no space in us untouched. Francis and Clare show us steps or stages in that growth process. And I thought that if we could reflect on some of these steps together, we might be able to see a graceful, courageous, hope-filled way forward for us today. From my study of the metanoia that Francis and Clare experienced and embodied, I have identified 5 key stages, and I want us to focus on the first 3 stages for now. The truth is, if we accomplish only these first 3 stages, we will already have moved deeply toward the changes that we and our world clearly need. I call the first step of metanoia the unexpected invitation. This stage speaks to the ways that life sometimes hands us something that causes us to question everything. Often this invitation is initially bewildering. It can be sudden, tragic, life-changing. Francis of Assisi's unexpected invitation came in the form of an entire year spent as a prisoner of war. He was 20 years old, a privileged young man, the heir apparent to his father's luxury cloth business. But families from his social class, who were merchants and not titled nobles, could not own property. And as they acquired more portable wealth, they sought and fought for the same rights of ownership that the nobility enjoyed. Francis's own father helped to fund a revolt of the merchant class when Francis was just 17 years old. This set a tragic cycle of violence into motion. The merchant class rose up against the nobles, sending them scurrying for refuge in neighboring Perugia. 3 years later, aligned with the Perugian army, members of the noble class mounted an attack to take back their homes and property. Now 20, Francis rode out with the other young men of Assisi to meet the Perugian forces at Collestrada, where he was quickly struck down and taken hostage. The year in prison gave Francis more than enough time to ruminate. That probably sounds familiar to us today. But all of the seeds of the rest of his impressive life were sown right there in that prison cell as Francis began to ask himself what was really worth fighting and dying for. To face the uncertainty of dying in a prison cell and feeling that there was nothing in his life that had been meaningful, lasting, or significant was a tremendous blow. Francis's disillusionment with the social assumptions of his day, coupled with the radical disruption of violence, added a particularly urgency to his search for meaning. He allowed this time of confinement and solitude to help him recognize and appreciate how much is at stake in the values that our communities embodied. And he became resolved that if there were something left to his life, he would certainly make the most of it. Restored to his home in Assisi, he began to question the value of returning to business as usual. Today, in all of the pause moments that this pandemic provides us, we can ask similar questions. What are we doing that truly helps, that might last, that might make our world a better place? Even now, perhaps especially now, we can commit ourselves to cultivating a greater thirst for the common good in conversations that will help us articulate all that is not working so that we can creatively orient ourselves toward a better way. But how will we know concretely what makes for a better way? The second stage in this process of metanoia entails genuine and caring relationships that can teach us the aliveness of God and give us eyes to see the beauty, fragility, and goodness of life. For Francis, this second stage of metanoia, which I'm calling eyes to see, occurred in one of the most frightening spaces of the medieval world, a leper colony. I'm going to take you there and recreate it for you and with you. But I'm also going to suggest at the outset that the poignancy of the spaces of misery and abandonment that leper colonies in the medieval world are really coming alive vividly for us in light of our current pandemic. Medieval lepers were the ultimate social outcasts. They were forced to live outside the city walls and were forbidden any touch or human contact. Their clothing, begging bowl, clapper, and warning bell set them apart from the world. They were considered so contaminated, so contagious, that they were prohibited from any common water sources, streams, fountains, or wells. Imagine their dependence. They could drink only from a small flask that hung from their necks, and they could only pray that others would fill that flask. As the disease progressed, lepers gradually lost physical function and simply wasted away, condemned to a slow and anonymous death in the colonies that set them apart. Like most of his contemporaries, young Francis very deliberately avoided any contact with their misery. So it was rather exceptional for Francis to feel himself drawn into a leper colony for the first time. In his testament, Francis tells us that this drawing inward was a singular grace of God. For it was the leper colony that stripped the scales off his eyes, and where, to his surprise, Francis experienced a surge, the first real surge of tenderness, an outpouring of love and solidarity that he knew was beyond his own capacity to generate. This was an experience of being pulled immediately out of the slump he'd been in, through a depth of connection that overcame him, a quickening of life flowing through him that now sought to extend itself into solidarity with people who had always horrified him. This moment showed Francis instantly and directly both who God was and who God called him to be. In addition to gaining the eyes to see lepers as his sisters and brothers, the relationship that Francis cultivated with them gave Francis eyes to see the world from their vantage point. It brought into new and deep relief the inequities in his world, along with the indifference, exclusion, and contempt that held the social structures firmly in place. The coldness and superficiality of his own lifestyle were also laid bare, as Francis realized that when it came to love, he had a great deal to learn from people he expected would never teach him anything. Will this virus, the vulnerability that it generates, the poignancy and intensity of human need that it exposes, now finally give us eyes to see? This can be our prayer in each moment. Give us eyes to see. A simple mantra that will lead us into the very heart of what it means to be human, to be a people, a single human family. As we look around at all those who are suffering the ravages of COVID-19, at those who are giving their lives to combat its impact, and also at all of the inequities and brokennesses in our cultures and social structures that the virus lays bare, what exactly does it give us eyes to see? And how will that sight, that insight, give us courage to change? For more perspective on these questions, let's walk with Francis again as he leaves the leper colony outside Assisi for the first time. His heart has been turned inside out. He knows something definitive has just happened to him. Something has now validated this vague discontent, this growing instinct in him to question his life, its meaning, and all of the goals that have been imposed upon him by his family and his society. Now the hollowness of all that he himself has willingly and anxiously embraced is suddenly exposed for what it is. Forlornly, Francis looks back up the hillside to the city that has been home for him all of his life, that he has given his life and his health to defend. Slowly he realizes that he is, in reality, just as homeless as the lepers who have shown him his own heart and have given him access to the very heart of God. Although it is still a deep and shocking mystery to him, Francis senses that down here, in the exposed plain of the valley, amidst those with nowhere else to go, he has finally found the ultimate meaning and purpose of his life: to work with others to make the world a home for all. Back in Assisi, the faces of his sisters and brothers in the leper colony remained with Francis, permeating his daily life and keeping him from business as usual within the city walls. There were the daily concerns about how they were doing, and the growing prioritization of solidarity with them, which led to deeper questions. Do I really have the right to pursue my own interests when others suffer so greatly and are so excluded? How do I live out my relationship with those who are suffering? What does our connection mean as it plays itself out in my own daily life? What do I eat? What should I wear? What do I do for a living? Who do I work for? What will I refuse to do? These kinds of questions started to gnaw at Francis, and while they were initially challenging, even overwhelming because he didn't know how to respond, Francis soon came to see the questions themselves as a profound grace and a rich invitation to change, a radical self-stripping, as he left behind his clothing, his title, his position, and all of the social fabric that had been his up to this point. Ultimately, it is our relationships with others that gives us the courage, the motivation, and discipline to make a real break with past patterns and forge something new. The third stage of metanoia, a threshold at which we, like Francis, now stand, is the space where connection and compassion deepen into solidarity and kinship, necessitating deeply rooted shifts in our way of life. When I write about this profound space in the tenderness of God, I say, it is neither too stark nor too simplistic to understand that Francis's encounters at the margins were revealing deep inconsistencies in his own life and in his culture. And now they were making certain demands of him. They required him to say no to forces in his society and culture that diminished human dignity, and asked him to choose instead toward a new and wonderfully complicated way of being connected to others, one that shows us what it is to be a people, to be part of a people. Will we too have the courage to choose this way of life? This evening, I'd like to join my voice to that of the mayor of Assisi, Stefania Proietti, whose Easter greetings this year to the citizens of Assisi and to the rest of the world as well proclaim this. Let's start now, together, soberly, humbly, to think about the future. May we start from the love of St. Francis, who, stripping himself of everything, has become a giant of the church and of universal spirituality, and has made our city great over centuries in history and in the collective imagination. Now more than ever, Assisi, the city of the patron saint of Italy, will be an emblem of hope and rebirth for the world. In the authenticity of the Franciscan message, we can find the strength of real life through solidarity and the preferential option for the poor and the needy. Only together, in solidarity and social cohesion, making ourselves a single family, as a united and supportive community, will we overcome this challenge and be reborn stronger than ever. As we move into this season of Easter, we can commit ourselves during this time of continuing quarantine and imposed stillness to a prayerful and committed intentionality that will allow the seeds of a more humane, more sustainable, more collaborative way of living together on this planet to germinate. Certain forms of courage will surely help us as we go. I'd like to end our reflection by exploring 7 types. The first is the courage to remember that we are not alone. We have God and we have one another. Our fears and the utter unbelievability of our current situation can cause us to forget the deeper primal reality that our God is with us, even when that is not entirely apparent. And when that does not feel quite so real to us, let us lean into the reality of our communities, of our relatedness, of the people in our lives who know us, who care about us, and who, along with us, struggle with fear and with all of the vulnerabilities that this virus lays bare. When it is hard to see what is most deeply real, may we have the courage to believe that love is still alive in our world, and to allow our connection with God and with one another to show us that this is so. Second, as we engage prayer, let us have the courage to ask God not just for what we want, but also for greater sensitivity to what God wants. Can we trust that God knows us better than we know ourselves? Can we trust that God knows what we need better than we do? The path forward is never obvious, not even to those who seem to have acted with such courage and foresight. I remember about 7 years ago going to Assisi for a week of prayer and reflection from a space of deep confusion, needing the inner counsel that a long heart-to-heart with God always provides. I went into a favorite chapel, and there was a contemporary poster of a young man huddled on the ground and looking utterly overwhelmed. Underneath him was written the simple phrase, "Nessuno mi diceva che cosa dovessi fare." No one told me what I should do. That line is taken from Francis of Assisi's Testament. It gave me so much consolation in that moment to know that even Francis, as inspired and enlightened as he was, had no one in his life to tell him what to do, especially as he was getting started. This reality taught him early on to turn constantly to God, to seek recourse, refuge, and daily counsel in all things from the source of love and light. We can do the same. And so, third, may we have a third kind of courage, the courage to let God teach us who God is and who we are. Instead of thinking that we already know God, may we have the courage to let God reveal God's self to us, to touch us in new ways, to surprise us with tenderness, comprehension, and care. And let us have a similar kind of courage as Francis and Clare did, the courage to find ourselves in God, to let God give us the kind of healthy self-knowledge individually and collectively that we and our world need. Thomas Merton once said, "To find ourselves is to find not only our poor, limited, perplexed souls, but also to find the power of God's love that builds us together into a dwelling place of you in the Spirit." The discovery of God is never genuine if it is nothing but a flight from ourselves. And so we must, for better and for worse, take all of ourselves to God, giving ourselves wholeheartedly into the process of change that genuine and healthy relationship with God is. The beautiful prayer of Rainer Maria Rilke comes to mind when he writes, "Let no part of me remain closed, for where I am closed, I am false." Let us go to God in these days with the knowledge that finding God is intended to be a truly transformative experience. We leave no part of ourselves behind, and therefore no part of us will be left untouched, unchanged. This transforming work of God in us is our treasure, our joy. No one and nothing can take that liberating, transforming process from us, even as we, in our fear, our hesitation, and our prioritization of other things, can defer, delay, even reject the invitation to newness in God that God continually offers us. So let us not delay. What more liberating and empowering thing is there than the thrill and safety and support of knowing that we are loved, knowing that we are not alone, knowing that we can risk ourselves on new endeavors and challenges precisely because we are not alone, but rather can become stronger and more creative and more resourceful in that space of shared energy, ideas, and support that we create with God and with one another. Fourth, let us have the courage to ask challenging questions. Our very character as individuals and as communities, as societies, nations, and even as a species, a human family, is at stake in the questions we ask. The better, the deeper the questions, the better and deeper the answers. We must ask deep and good questions, particularly when so many people in our world seem satisfied with partial, superficial, and even incorrect, inadequate, and ideological answers. We are already seeing how this pandemic gives us eyes to see many of the patterns, habits, and systems that have not supported human wholeness or the well-being of our earth. Now is the time to ask the hardest questions about what truly matters and what doesn't. Let's go back to Thomas Merton, who also said, "The first step in the interior life is to unlearn our wrong ways of seeing, tasting, feeling, and so forth, in order to acquire a few of the right ones." Let us have the courage to allow God and those in need to help us ask and answer the pressing questions of our time. Fifth, let us have the courage not to hold back. Let us offer our best ideas, our best next steps, one step at a time. What is your prayer for the world? Pray it now. What is the one best thing that you can do for the well-being of the world? Do it. What are you waiting for? Embrace the habit of going directly to the one thing, the one best thing that you can do each day. And don't forget to consult with God about what that thing might be. Resolve to know that in you, especially in the space where God dwells, is a wellspring of creativity, goodness, and generosity. As each of us shares with others that wellspring of grace, we can set new goals for ourselves and for our world, giving of ourselves generously and forging new ways through the depth of our collaboration. Anne Frank wisely observed, "No one has ever become poor by giving." Sixth, let us have the courage to be prophetic in a culture and a world that lacks both eyes to see and the habit of thinking collaboratively about the common good. As we learn these habits, we can model them, and together we can forge a new path toward human flourishing by walking together. Finally, it is worth recognizing the obvious. All of these types of courage will be useless if we do not have the courage to love. Just as the peace that the world gives us is not the same as the peace that God gives us, the love that God is brings a qualitative difference to every aspect of our lives. Let us have the courage to seek out that love, trust in that love, be changed by that love, and be instruments of that love to bring peace, healing, and new ways of being a human community into our world. How will we emerge from this pandemic? Instead of allowing that question to strike fear and foreboding in our hearts, let us have the courage to use this time to forge deeper relationships with God, self, and other, allowing the space where the signs of our times intersect with the promptings of the Spirit to teach us who we should become individually and collectively. The changes that this pandemic will draw out of us still lie unformed before us. We have entered into a long, dark tunnel of undetermined length. Let us have the courage and grace to embrace this time and space as a cocoon, a place of growth, gestation, and change. Let us ask for and commit ourselves to the courage to change, prioritizing and discerning together what better leads to God's deepening life in us and in our world. May it be so. Amen.
Okay. Dr. Ahlgren, thank you so much for helping us explore what it means to practice courage amid this crisis. We have some questions that have been submitted. I'd like to ask you the first one. Sometimes it's difficult to muster courage, as you suggested. What prayer practices do you recommend for finding the courage to change?
We're lucky to have many, many practices of prayer, many approaches to prayer. And I suggest that this is a wonderful time to experiment with them. The ones that are have become very, very natural to me are the practices of what's called in the Ignatian tradition colloquy, where we simply speak in very familiar terms with the, as Teresa would say, the one who we know loves us, the one who already knows what's most deeply in our hearts, and to whom we can confide anything and everything. So engaging a colloquial form of prayer where God can become our friend, our counselor, and our companion is an important practice. If we haven't tried it, we might begin. To also pray with a kind of what's been called sometimes rummaging. You know, if we find, that I think of it as the gerbil wheel that runs around on the left side of our brain, and anxiety can speed that process up, to kind of go into that gerbil wheel and pull out the stuff that's in there and hold it up and lift it up, and sort through it with God in that kind of colloquial dialogue. These are prayer practices that are rooted ultimately in honesty, and they're very practical, and they themselves teach us that God actually cares about the minutia of our days and walks with us through that minutia, as well as all of the big picture questions and the things that mostly deeply concern us. So the more that we acquire the habit of sharing everything with God, the easier it is to get to the deepest things that we have to share with God.
Thank you for that. The next question asks, courage is grounded in relationships, as you suggested. How can we better nurture those relationships in the midst of a pandemic when so much of our life has now gone to screen?
Yes. Isn't it interesting? I mean, how really part of the biggest task of this time in our lives is to make sure, first of all, that we do have some relationships in our lives that are rich, and that we can lean into. One of the first things that I did when it looked like we were going to be in quarantine for quite a while, I actually got concerned that, boy, maybe the mail service is going to shut down, and maybe this is the last chance for me to say what's in my mind and heart, and share all of those things with the people I care about. So I actually took pencil and pen to paper and wrote out letters. Now is the time to say what is on your mind and in your heart to the ones that you love, to recognize and reach out to people who have mentored you, to have helped you to know yourself, to reach out in gratitude. You end up, when you do this, you end up realizing just how very rich your life is. And it gives you a sense of gratitude that can also help sustain you in times of anxiety and concern and worry.
So as one listener said, each of us has the potential to have a metanoia experience as a part of COVID-19, but we're not all on the brink of becoming Francis of Assisi. So what are the barriers to change that are holding us back? Or maybe put more positively, what do we need to do to ready ourselves for a metanoia experience?
Okay. This is a great question. First of all, there's very, very little about Francis or Clare, for that matter, that's all that different from us. And that's something that becomes very apparent, when you walk in the footsteps and you see this, you see Francis. Francis was a party man, life of the party kind of guy. And he probably got himself into a lot of trouble. He was probably your typical college student. So first of all, I would question whether or not each of us is so different from Francis and Clare. We're all, in fact, as Pope Francis would remind us, we're all called to holiness, even as the fingerprint of holiness, the fingerprint, the uniqueness of your relationship with God. Every individual person's relationship with God is unique, and that is one of the things that we really can and must begin to explore. What is it that is mine to do? Who am I, and what has God given me to do? Who is God asking me? Who's God in the world around me asking me to become? Those are questions that all of us can ask.
There's another one, it's kind of similar in vein to it. And it says, has there ever been an invitation like the current crisis before when the whole world's experienced this at the same time? And how many can we expect to move on to the next stage and gain eyes to see?
Yeah. Well, doesn't that depend on us? I mean, hopefully one of these, I keep hearing the adjective unprecedented. Yes, that's the one, you hear that word a lot, right? These are unprecedented times, unprecedented days. And I don't disagree with that at all. I think that's actually a very apt description. And I would hope that it only takes one unprecedented time for us to wake up, smell the coffee, and start to get these eyes to see, right? Which is a lifelong process, of course. But I do also want to harken back, and this is another reason it's good to know your history, and it's good to really explore the lives and teachings of the mystics and the wise ones in our tradition. I'm thinking, I have thought so much of Julian of Norwich, the anchoress in England who lived through the Black Death, the plague, when she was only 4 or 5 years old when it first hit England in 1349. First of all, I guess another thing to know about the Black Death, the plague, is that it came around in cycles. It hit once tremendously intensely the first time, but then it reverberated around. And so we estimate that 1/3 of all inhabitants of Europe died in the course of 1 year, which must have seemed like as much of a universal tragedy as could have been experienced in a pre-modern society. And if 1/3 of Europe died, then 2/3 were left with survivor guilt, anguish, and all kinds of meaning questions, especially if many of those who had passed were loved ones. So there are some precedents, there are some people we can turn to for similar kinds of calamitous situations and circumstances to provide us not just with models for how to get through them, but if you read Julian Norwich's showings, she ends up discovering a tender God who is, as she writes, closer to us than our own skin. So she also allows a time of tremendous and profound change and distress to be a point of entry into learning the closeness of the incarnate God.
And we have one last question for you. And this comes from Sister Margaret Carney. Do you think the current...
Goodness, what an honor. Thank you.
She wants to know, do you think that the current crisis can help us to make the stories of the saints more relevant as people seek hope and models for the future?
Yeah. Well, yes, I hope so. One of the more interesting things that I've learned about some of the very significant saints and mystics in our tradition is that in their own ways, many of them suffered life-changing experiences that we could even call traumatic experiences as young people. You think of Ignatius of Loyola, for example, who had carved out something of a life for himself, only to have the rug pulled completely out from under him when a cannonball came in, splintered his leg, and stole his vocation, his life career from him, and he had to start again from scratch. Teresa of Avila, the 16th century mystic and doctor of prayer, lost her mother at a very early age, and herself had some very significant illnesses, so significant that we might even think of them, at least one of them, as near-death experiences. She writes that she woke up, and when she woke up, there was wax in her eyes. In other words, her body had been prepared for death and for anointing, and so. And John of the Cross, another person who, as a very young person, experienced the extremes of poverty. Many of the saints were people who have come back from debilitating experiences. And so what I've learned in my own, quote unquote, walking with the saints is that the same resources that we sometimes think will help us in what we call spiritual formation also help us in what we could call identity reformation, when life and our circumstances have knocked the wind out of us, have taken something from us, and we find ourselves needing to put the pieces of our lives back together again. The saints give us wise counsel, and they can become our friends, our companions on the way.
Again, Dr. Ahlgren, thank you so much for helping us to explore what it means to practice courage amid crisis. Thank you, too, for all those who joined us this evening. This live stream will be available as a recording on the Bellarmine Chapel YouTube channel. Please feel free to share it with others. And finally, a note for next time, we will be partnering again with the Institute for Spirituality and Social Justice for another live stream talk on Monday, May 4th at 7:30 p.m. with Dr. Ashley Thuring, entitled Trauma and Recovery in a Time of COVID-19. Join us to explore trauma theology in the hopes that what we already know about trauma can help us survive and thrive in this moment. Dr. Thuring is a parishioner at Bellarmine and a theologian on the faculty of Xavier's Theology Department. We do hope that we will get to see you again soon. Thanks for joining us this evening, and stay safe.
Thank you so much.